So in the last video, Ramana Maharshi was talking about the world is not real, and then you will have that realization when the mind becomes quiet down, right? So now the Sivaprakasam Pillai is asking that what is the nature of the mind? And Ramana Maharshi replies, the nature of the mind is thoughts. So whenever we are thinking, any kind of thought is basically the nature of the mind, right? And then he says, this thoughts cannot arise without depending on something gross, right? So these thoughts are about something gross always. These thoughts cannot exist independently, right? The mind cannot exist independently. It is always going to exist uh, in the dependence of something gross, right? And then he points out uh, very interesting experience. He says in the deep sleep there is no thoughts, there is no mind, so there is no world, right? So in the experience of the deep sleep you're not experiencing any world or thoughts or mind or anything, right? So that is the experience of self, he says, right? In the deep sleep there is no mind, but you are experiencing the self. But when you wake up and you start start acting in the world, then the mind start to become active and start to emit the world like a spider, and then it resolve it back into itself, right? So that is what he is referring here. We'll try to understand what it means. And then he says, if you continuously keep inquiring the nature of the mind will stop leaving the self, and then it start becomes, then it will become quiet and it stays in the self itself, right? Very interesting. So the first thing is the nature of the mind is the thought. The thoughts are the nature of the mind, right? What are the thoughts? So the thought is basically what we are constantly having this dialogue inside ourselves, right? There is a voice that is keep talking inside our health, inside ourselves, right? And it just keep talking all the time, right? And it is doing it automatically, right? It's amazing, right? That, for example, other organs, it's like, for example, if I have hand or leg or something like that, they are not doing things by themselves, but the mind seems to be creating these thoughts by themselves. Mind keeps talking by themselves, right? Mind keep talking by itself, right? It talks about all kind of things, right? It talks about how could I have done something different the last time, how can I do this, how can I do that, and it even talks about things like what kind of person I am, or you know it can have anything, any kind of thought can come into the mind, right? uh, it's very interesting that mind can do this, right? These thoughts can be automatic, and mind can create these thoughts automatically. And the Ramana Maharshi is saying this realm of thought, this space of thoughts is what the mind is, right? The mind is thoughts. Very interesting. And then he says these thoughts are always about something, right? These thoughts are always about something gross. They cannot exist independently, right? So that is true. If we look into our mind, we'll see the mind is always talking about something else, right? It's talking about other people, it is talking about the food, the future, the past, all kind of things. It's just always going to talk something about uh, gross, right? It is always going to talk about something gross. It's going to talk about the senses. It may talk about yourself, right? It may talk about, like, look how uh, what kind of person I am or something. But it always have some subject. It's never going to be about nothing. It's always going to be about something gross, right? So these are the two things Raman Maharshi is pointing out about thoughts, that mind is thought and it is always talking about something gross, right? Okay. Then he says that in the deep sleep there is no mind, right? And so there is no world in the deep sleep, right? And then he says that when you are not experiencing the mind, you are experiencing the self. But when you wake up and you start working, then when you start experiencing the mind, you are not experiencing the self, right? The argument he made in the last verse also. So the first thing is our own experience of the deep sleep is in the deep sleep. So even when we are sleeping and we are dreaming, the mind is still active. Mind is still creating its own thoughts, and all the melodrama that it creates. So mind is still active in the dreaming even while we are sleeping, right? It's creating a different world altogether. But while we are in the deep sleep, there is no thoughts, right? And that is true. In the deep sleep there is no thoughts and there is no mind, like that, right? And so there is also no world, right? We have no awareness of any kind of world in the deep sleep. uh, so that is also true, right? This argument that in the deep sleep we are experiencing the experience of no mind, that is true, right? And then the second argument is, so when you are experiencing the no mind, you are experiencing the self. That's what the Ramana Maharshi is saying. And then when we wake up, then the mind start to create thoughts, and thoughts are like, the spider is emitting web, and then it is resolving it back into itself, and then that's the way, the mechanism of the mind, that's how the mind is working. So the one part we can clearly understand with our own experience, that in the deep sleep there is no thoughts or there is no mind. In fact, there is no sense of time, right? So when I'm in the deep sleep, I don't even know how long I was in that state, right? There's absolutely experience of kind of nothing, right? In fact, I am not even experiencing anything there, right? It's just like kind of nothingness. That's all there is, right? And the Raman Maharshi, so the first argument is very clear. We are experiencing no mind in the deep sleep. The second argument that Raman Maharshi is making here is that that is the experience of self. You know, this is what the self is. You're experiencing the self when you're not experiencing the mind. And this is a little bit challenging to understand, because while we are awake and we are not having any thoughts, right? There can be times in the day when we are not having any thoughts or we are not having any mind experience. In that state, there is still this sense of knowing, right? There's still this sense of awareness that is there, right? We are still experiencing, uh, we are still there, right? There's still this awareness is there, there's still this sense of knowing is there. But while we are in the deep sleep, we don't have that awareness and the knowing also, right? It is just like there's nothing, right? There's nothing. It's just uh, it's blank, right? There's no awareness of that blankness also, right? So there's a little bit difference there, right? And what Buddha is mentioning was the experience of the deep sleep is the experience of the pure dullness, is the experience of the pure ignorance, right? And both of the argument is making sense, right? In the deep sleep, there is no experience of any kind of awareness also. Of course, there is no experience of the mind and the thoughts also, but there is also no experience of any kind of awareness of knowing, right? um, but while we are awake and we are not having any thoughts or anything, we have at least some awareness of knowing, right? There's difference there, right? So Buddha was saying there is a, the deep sleep could be the experience of ignorance, and the Ramana Maharshi is mentioning the deep sleep is the experience of the self, right? We can park it and we can see how the book goes forward if we see it more clearly what it means. But certainly there is an experience of no mind in the deep sleep, right? And that experience can be taken as a uh, benchmark, like, okay, this is the experience of no mind and this is the experience of the mind. And then the Ramana Maharshi says that when somebody constantly inquires the nature of the mind stop doing this. The mind stop creating these thoughts and start to stay in the self, right? So this inquiry, if you continuously do this inquiry, then the mind will stop creating all these thoughts and stop creating all this world, and then will start to stay in the self itself.